Duke Julian Wexford publicly separated from his wife at the very moment the first merchant vessel struck the hidden reef outside Wexford Harbor. The news arrived before the wrecking bell had finished its third toll, carried into the great hall by a drenched harbor runner whose boots left black crescents across the polished floor. "The Mercy Bell is breaking apart below the eastern cliffs," he gasped. 20 souls aboard, Your Grace. And the tide is dragging her toward the rocks." No one moved at first. The Wexford Winter Assembly had gathered to celebrate the opening of a new trade season. Shipowners in dark wool, magistrates in silver-buttoned coats, tenant representatives, officers from the customs house, and every influential family within 30 miles. Candles trembled in their sconces. Beyond the tall windows, rain lashed the harbor lamps into blurred yellow stars. Marianne Wexford rose from her chair before any man at the long table had found his voice. Her deep blue gown caught against the edge of the map table as she reached for the coastal chart. "The eastern channel should have been closed at dawn," she said, her fingers already tracing the inked line between the reef and the headland. "The tide is wrong for a vessel of that weight. Send the rescue boats from Lantern Quay, not the main pier. They will lose time turning against the current." For 7 years, the Duchess of Wexford had known the moods of that water better than most captains knew their own tempers. She had learned it beside her father, a Liverpool merchant whose business had depended on ships returning safely, not merely profitably. She understood tides, insurance bonds, cargo routes, and the tiny dishonesty hidden in a document written by a man who believed women only noticed the wax seal. The harbour masters had once obeyed her without hesitation, but Julian did not look at the chart. He stood at the head of the table, pale and rigid in his black evening coat, one hand braced against the carved chair that had belonged to his grandfather. At his right stood Gideon Vale, Julian's half-brother, immaculate despite the storm, his fair hair tied neatly at his nape, and his expression arranged into concern. "You will not give another order in my name," Julian said. Marianne's hand stopped above the map. Around them, the room seemed to draw one breath. "Julian," she said quietly, "there are people drowning, and there are questions that must be answered before you are permitted near another ledger, another chart, or another man under my authority." His voice was steady, but she knew him too well not to hear the strain beneath it. He had spent the last 3 days receiving letters from London, letters he would not let her read. He had avoided her eyes at breakfast. He had begun sleeping in his study, claiming work, though Marianne had heard him pacing until dawn. Now Lady Celia Harrow stepped from the gathered guests, dressed in pearl-grey silk and wearing the small, sorrowful expression of a woman who had never once suffered the misfortune she appeared to understand. Her father's votes in Parliament could preserve Julian's political future. Everyone in the hall knew it. Celia laid a folded document on the table. "The Crown's shipping office has received evidence," she said softly, "that certain Wexford manifests were altered before departure." Marianne looked at the paper, then at Julian. "You believe I altered them?" Julian's jaw tightened. "I believe your seal appears on them. My seal is kept in the harbour office." "It was kept there," Gideon said, "under your authority." Marianne turned toward him. On his little finger gleamed a sailor's knot ring of dull blackened silver. For one strange instant, the crash of rain and the murmur of frightened guests vanished from her mind. She had seen that ring before, not in a drawing room, not on Gideon's hand, but in an old insurance affidavit concerning Captain Elias Venn, the man declared drowned when the North Star went down 3 years earlier. The captain's effects had supposedly been recovered from the sea. The ring had been listed among them. "Where did you get that?" Marianne asked. Gideon's smile barely shifted. "A family trinket." "No," she said. "It belonged to Captain Venn." Julian's gaze flickered toward Gideon, but only for a moment. Then the harbour bell began again, louder now, more desperate, each strike carrying through the shutters like a hammer against bone. Marianne stepped toward the door. "We can settle this After the rescue boats leave, Julian moved into her path. "You will remain here," she stared at him. "If the Mercy Belle is lost, the families at Lantern Cay will lose fathers, sons, and wages before morning. This is precisely why I cannot trust you to interfere." The words struck more cleanly than a slap. Marianne saw the discomfort in his face after he said them, saw that some part of him wanted to take them back. But he did not. Instead, he lifted the silver harbor seal from the table, where it had rested beside the charts. The seal had been entrusted to Marianne on their wedding day, not as an ornament, but because Julian had once told her Wexford needed someone who cared more for its people than its prestige. Now he placed it in Gideon's waiting hand. "Until further notice," Julian announced to the room, "Mr. Vale will oversee all harbor operations. My wife is relieved of every duty connected to Wexford Port. She will also withdraw from Wexford Hall under separate maintenance until the inquiry is concluded." Silence followed. Marianne did not plead. She would not give Celia the satisfaction, nor Gideon the spectacle, nor Julian the excuse to call her unstable. She looked instead at the chart, at the eastern reef marked in faded blue ink, and saw what no one else in the room had noticed. The Mercy Belle had departed from a berth that should have been empty. Its scheduled cargo had been transferred 2 days earlier. Someone had sent it into the storm carrying a false manifest, and had arranged Julian's public accusation on the very same night. Marianne lifted her chin. "This was never about the manifests," she said. "You did not remove me because you think I am guilty. You removed me because someone needs the harbor unguarded." Gideon closed his fingers around the seal. Outside, a fourth bell toll rolled over Wexford Harbor, and from the black water below the cliffs, a distant lantern flashed 3 times in a signal belonging to a ship that should have been dead. The lantern flashed again from the black water below the cliffs. 3 short bursts, then darkness, and Marianne felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, as if she had summoned it herself. Gideon Vale was the first to speak. "A smuggler's signal," he said, his voice calm enough to sound authoritative. "It appears your grace was right to relieve the Duchess of her duties." Julian's face hardened, though uncertainty passed briefly through his grey eyes. Marianne knew that hesitation. It was the same expression he had worn during their first winter at Wexford, when she had warned him that a trusted steward was skimming grain payments from the northern tenants. He had doubted her then too, until the missing sacks were found beneath the steward's own barn. Back then, Julian had apologized before the servants, placed the estate ledgers in her hands, and told her Wexford was safer because she noticed what pride taught men to ignore. Tonight, however, Gideon stood beside him, Lady Celia watched from the shadows, and the harbour bell continued to call for men who might already be dying. "The rescue boats," Marianne said, forcing her voice to remain even. "If Gideon believes the signal belongs to smugglers, he may send customs officers after it later. But Lantern Cay must leave now." Julian did not answer. Gideon did. "The main pier crews have been instructed to hold position until we know whether this wreck is connected to the Duchess's alterations." Marianne turned toward him. "You have instructed them. Your husband has entrusted the harbour to me." Gideon's fingers closed more firmly around the silver seal. "And I will not risk more Wexford men, because you are eager to erase evidence." That was the lie he needed them all to accept. Not merely that Marianne had made an error, but that she had something to hide. She looked across the crowded hall and found Mr. Thomas Bell, the old harbour clerk, standing near the door with his hat crushed between both hands. Bell had worked at Wexford Port since before Julian inherited the title. His hair was white now, his back bent, but he had once taught Marianne how to read the marks carved into mooring posts after floods. He would know the rescue boats were being delayed. He would know that every minute mattered. Marianne held his gaze for one silent second, then shifted her eyes toward the servants' passage behind the musicians' gallery. Bell did not nod. He only disappeared from the hall. Gideon noticed nothing. He was busy unfolding the document Celia had brought and reading aloud passages meant to make Marianne sound guilty: altered cargo values, missing customs stamps, a shipment listed under an unfamiliar company name. Yet the more he spoke, the clearer the deception became. Her father had taught her that a false account was rarely perfect. It was written by someone clever enough to copy the form, but too impatient to understand the life inside the numbers. The company named in the document, Blackthorn Maritime, had not existed 6 months ago. Its stated warehouse was a cooper's yard with no access to deep water, and the cargo listed as lamp oil weighed nearly twice what the Mersey Belle could carry safely through the Eastern Channel. Marianne had no proof she could use yet, only pieces. But pieces were enough to tell her one thing: the wreck had been arranged. "May I see the original manifests?" she asked. Julian's expression became guarded. "They have been secured." "By whom?" "By Mr. Vale," Celia answered before Julian could speak. Marianne let the silence that followed expose the answer for what it was. The man accusing her controlled the evidence. Julian should have heard it. He should have stopped everything, demanded that the papers be sealed by a magistrate, and sent the boats without waiting for the spectacle he had created to end. Instead, he looked toward Gideon as if he required permission from the very man who had gained from Marianne's fall. "You will retire to your rooms," Julian said. "You will not contact any harbor employee, tenant, or shipowner until the inquiry is complete." Marianne's breath caught, not because she feared him, but because she understood the shape of the command. He was not merely separating from her, he was cutting every thread that allowed her to protect the people who depended upon the harbor. "Then listen carefully," she said. "I will obey your order concerning this house, but I will not obey an order that leaves men to drown." His mouth tightened. "Do not make this more difficult. You made it impossible the moment you gave him that seal." For the first time, Julian flinched. It was small, almost invisible, but Marianne saw it. Gideon saw it as well, and his courteous expression cooled. "Your Grace," he said, "the Duchess appears unwilling to accept the consequences of her conduct." Marianne ignored him. She lifted the thick blue chart from the table and spread it open beneath the candlelight. "The eastern reef is exposed only when the tide is falling," she said, pointing to the figures along the edge. "At this hour, the water should have carried the Mersey Belle westward, unless someone placed false channel markers near the shoals." Several shipowners exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Captain Rourke, stepped forward. "There were lights where no lights should have been," he admitted. "I saw them from the ridge." Gideon's head turned sharply. "Captain, you were not asked to give testimony." "No," Marianne said, still watching Julian. "But he has given it." The room shifted. Not enough to save her, not enough to break the accusation, but enough for doubt to enter. Julian looked down at the map. His hand hovered near the blue chart, then withdrew before his fingers touched it. "Mr. Vale will investigate the markers," he said. "The matter remains closed for tonight." Marianne almost laughed at the cruelty of it. Gideon would investigate the evidence that pointed toward Gideon. Julian had chosen not to see it, because seeing it would mean admitting he had publicly destroyed the one person who had kept his harbor alive. A maid appeared at Marianne's elbow with a travel cloak, her eyes red. It was Elsie, barely 19, the daughter of a fisherman drowned in the Wexford Channel 2 winters before. Marianne had quietly arranged the girl's position in the household when there had been no wages left at home. Elsie pressed the cloak into her hands and whispered, "Mr. Bell sent the boats, Your Grace." They left from the old slip. Relief moved through Marianne so fiercely that she had to close her fingers around the wool to steady herself. Julian heard the whisper. His face changed, not with anger at first, but with something more complicated: recognition. He knew exactly what she had done. She had broken his command, but she had also saved lives he had allowed pride to endanger. "You sent them?" he asked. Marianne met his eyes. "I gave no order. I reminded a good man of his duty. Gideon stepped forward. Then Belle must be dismissed at once. No, Julian said. The word came out harsher than intended, and Gideon paused. Julian looked at Marianne again, rain-shadowed light moving across his face. Belle will remain until I decide otherwise. It was the smallest protection, almost nothing, but Marianne recognized it for what it was. Not trust, not remorse, merely the first crack in the wall Julian had built around himself. She could not rely on it. She would not mistake it for rescue. 2 footmen escorted her from the hall. As she crossed the threshold, she looked back once. Gideon stood at the map table, with the harbor seal in his hand, and Lady Celia leaned close to Julian, speaking low enough that no one else could hear. But Marianne heard one sentence before the doors shut behind her. "By morning," Celia murmured, "she will have no place left to go." In her chamber, Marianne found her trunks already opened, her correspondence removed, and every drawer searched. Yet beneath the false bottom of her writing desk, where she had hidden the old tied notebook her father gave her on her wedding day, someone had left a single object, a wet brass compass, its glass cracked, its needle fixed stubbornly toward the eastern reef. Engraved on its back were the initials E.V., Elias Venn, the captain who had supposedly drowned 3 years ago. Engraved on its back were the initials E.V., Elias Venn, the captain who had supposedly drowned 3 years ago. Marianne turned the cracked compass beneath the candlelight, studying the object without touching the broken glass. Salt crusted its brass rim. The leather cord threaded through its ring was freshly wet, not stiffened by years beneath the sea, and a tiny scrap of dark blue wool clung to the clasp. Someone had placed it in her desk only minutes ago. Someone who knew exactly where Marianne kept the tied notebook, and who wanted her to understand that Captain Venn had not gone down with the North Star after all. The door opened behind her. Elsie slipped inside, breathless and frightened, carrying a small tray of tea she had clearly used as an excuse to evade the footman posted outside Marianne's chamber. "They are saying the rescue boats found survivors," she whispered. "But Mr. Vale has ordered everyone at the quay to stay silent until he gives a statement." Marianne looked up. "How many? No one knows. Mr. Vale sent word through the scullery maid. He said the old slip was nearly flooded, and one boat came back damaged. He said," Elsie swallowed, "he said they found no captain aboard the Mercy Belle. That was not merely unfortunate. A vessel leaving Wexford Harbor without its registered captain violated every rule Marianne's father had taught her to respect. It meant the ship had been sent out in haste, or someone had wanted no experienced man alive to explain why it had been directed toward a reef." Marianne opened her tied notebook. The leather cover was cracked from years of use, and beneath its pages lay the narrow brass ruler her father had once carried in his waistcoat pocket. On the final page, she had written the predicted currents for the entire week. The Mercy Belle could not have reached the eastern reef by accident, unless its course had been changed before the storm began. "Elsie," Marianne said, "did you see who searched this room? Mr. Vale's steward, Mr. Pritchard, and 2 men from the customs house. Did either of them bring this compass?" Elsie shook her head. "Not that I saw." Marianne glanced toward the closed door. "Then someone entered after they left. Should I hide it? No. If they come for it, I want them to believe they have frightened me into keeping it close." Her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. The day had stripped away her authority, her public dignity, and perhaps her marriage. But it had not stripped away the part of her that could read a lie. Marianne folded the notebook inside the sleeve of her traveling cloak, then placed the compass in the shallow drawer of her dressing table, where any searching hand would find it immediately. "Help me dress," she told Elsie. "Your Grace, the Duke said you must remain here. The Duke also gave command of a harbor to the man most likely to have endangered it. I do not intend to make his mistake easier." 20 minutes later, Marianne descended the narrow service stairs wearing a plain brown cloak and a maid's bonnet tied low over her hair. Elsie followed behind with a basket of linens over one arm. They moved through the kitchen passage while the household remained occupied by the storm and the scandal unfolding downstairs. At the rear gate, old Mr. Bell waited beside a cart piled with wet rope. His face was grey with exhaustion, and blood darkened one sleeve. "I thought they had sent you away," he said. "They have," Marianne replied. "That does not make the water safer." Bell's expression broke for a moment, almost like grief. "4 survivors, 2 dead, the rest are missing. We found the Mercy Bell's mate tied beneath the overturned longboat, barely conscious. He kept saying he followed the lanterns, said the channel lights moved." Marianne's fingers tightened around the edge of the cart. "Where is he now?" "At the old sailmaker's shed. The surgeon is tending him." "And Gideon?" Bell looked toward the harbor. "Mr. Vale has taken the official crew to the main pier. He wants the rescue report written under his own seal before dawn." "Of course he did. Control the report, control the wreck, control the story." Marianne climbed into the cart without another word. Wexford Harbor lay beneath the storm like a battlefield. Rain swept sideways across the cobbles. The ships groaned against their moorings, and men carrying lanterns ran between piles of soaked rope and shattered crates. At the far end of the quay, a crowd had gathered around a line of survivors wrapped in tarpaulins. Marianne kept her face lowered as Bell guided her past them to the sailmaker's shed. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, wet wool, and blood. A young man lay on a work table, his skin colorless beneath salt water and shock. His name was Samuel Coates, Bell told her, the Mercy Bell's first mate. His lips trembled as Marianne approached. "Captain?" she asked softly. Samuel's eyes opened. "Mr. Harland never came aboard," he murmured. "A gentleman gave the order, said the Duke required the ship to sail before the tide turned." "What gentleman?" "Could not see his face, black oilskin, but he had." Samuel's hand moved weakly toward his own finger. "A ring, a rope knot, silver." Marianne felt the cold settle deeper inside her. Gideon's ring. Yet testimony from a half-conscious sailor would not be enough. Gideon would call it delirium, Julian would call it desperation, and Lady Celia would mourn delicately over the dangers of false accusation. Marianne needed something that could not forget, panic, or be persuaded to change its story. She crossed to the pile of recovered cargo stacked by the shed wall. Most of it was marked as lamp oil, just as the manifest claimed, but one crate had split open in the wreck, revealing not sealed tins of oil, but heavy lead weights packed around a small iron case. Marianne knelt, ignoring the mud soaking through her skirt. The case bore the crest of Blackthorn Maritime. She touched the locking clasp, then drew back. "Do not open it," Bell warned. "It could be contraband." "That is exactly why it must remain closed," Marianne said. "Fetch the parish constable, not a harbour officer, and find Captain Rourke." "He saw the false lights." Bell hesitated. "If Vale learns you are here, he will." Marianne stood. "But not before we establish who found this crate, where it was recovered, and who touched it." Her father's lessons returned with merciless clarity. Evidence was not merely proof, it was a chain. Break one link, and a clever liar would call the whole thing worthless. Bell sent a boy racing through the rain. Marianne wrote the time in her notebook, the location of the crate, the names of the 2 fishermen who had lifted it from the water, and the exact condition of its broken seal. She was finishing the final line when the shed door slammed open. Gideon Vale stood framed by rain and harbor light, his dark cloak glistening at the shoulders. Behind him came Julian, his face drawn and furious, followed by Lady Celia, beneath a black umbrella held by a servant. Gideon's gaze dropped at once to the iron case. For the first time that night, his composure failed, only for a heartbeat. But Marianne saw it. So did Julian. "Marianne," Julian said, "what are you doing here?" Protecting the evidence you gave Mr. Vale authority to destroy. Gideon recovered quickly. Your Grace, this is precisely the behavior I warned you about. The Duchess has interfered with an active investigation. Julian's eyes moved from Marianne's mud-stained hands to the crate, then to the careful notes in her notebook. Why was the cargo listed as lamp oil? He asked. Gideon smiled faintly. Smugglers disguise their goods, surely. It only strengthens the case against her. Marianne looked at Julian. Then asked him why he already knew it was smuggling before the crate was opened. Julian went still. The contradiction hung between them, sharp as a blade. Gideon had spoken too soon. For one breath, Marianne believed Julian might finally demand the truth. But Lady Celia touched his sleeve, and Julian's shoulders stiffened with the old instinct to protect his name from public humiliation. Take the crate to the harbor office, he ordered Gideon. Seal it there. Marianne stepped forward. No, it must go to the constable. Julian's expression closed. You are in no position to command anyone. Gideon gave a short bow, but his eyes remained fixed on Marianne with a new and colder understanding. He no longer saw her as a disgraced wife, clinging to a lost position. He saw the only person in Wexford who could dismantle the machine he had spent years building. As his men lifted the iron case, Marianne noticed a strip of blue wool caught beneath its broken edge, the same shade she had found on Captain Ven's compass. And stitched into the fabric, almost hidden by rain and salt, was a tiny gold thread forming the unmistakable crest of Gideon Vale. And stitched into the fabric, almost hidden by rain and salt, was a tiny gold thread forming the unmistakable crest of Gideon Vale. Marianne let the wet scrap fall back against the iron case before anyone else could see it. Gideon was watching her too closely. If she exposed the thread now, he would call it planted evidence, and Julian, already humiliated by the suggestion that he had been deceived, might seize on any excuse not to believe her. She needed more than a crest on torn cloth. She needed the chain that connected Gideon to the false manifests, the vanished captain, the wrecked vessel, and the money that would inevitably follow the disaster. Take it, she said, stepping away from the crate. Gideon's brows rose slightly. How sensible. I did not say it belongs in your office, Marianne replied. I said take it. But Captain Rourke, Mr. Bell, and the 2 fishermen who recovered it will accompany the crate until it is sealed. Julian looked at her sharply. You have no authority to impose conditions. No, Marianne said, but they have witnessed its recovery, and they have every right to protect their own names from whatever happens next. Captain Rourke, a broad-shouldered man, with rain dripping from the brim of his hat, shifted his weight. The Duchess is correct, Your Grace. I will not sign a recovery statement if the cargo disappears between this shed and the harbor office. Bell stood beside him, silent but firm. Gideon's smile thinned. He had expected Marianne to protest, perhaps weep, perhaps accuse him recklessly and give Julian a reason to remove her entirely. Instead, she had given the frightened men in the room something safer than courage: procedure. Julian studied the faces around him. Marianne knew he disliked being forced to choose publicly, especially when the choice revealed that other people had noticed a weakness in his judgment. At last he said, Very well, the witnesses will accompany the crate. It will be sealed in my study, not the harbor office. Gideon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a small victory, hardly enough to alter the night, but Marianne held it close. The crate would not vanish without witnesses. Before Gideon's men lifted it, she bent as if to gather the fallen edge of her skirt and pressed 2 fingers briefly against the blue wool. When she straightened, a single gold thread clung to her glove. She slipped it beneath the cuff of her sleeve. No one noticed except Gideon. His eyes met hers. The look he gave her contained no surprise now, only calculation. Julian ordered Marianne back to Wexford Hall under escort. This time she did not argue. The harbor had become Gideon's stage. and Marianne could do more harm to his plans by appearing defeated than by forcing another confrontation he was prepared to win. During the carriage ride, rain struck the roof in hard, uneven bursts. Elsie sat across from her, hands clenched in her lap. "What will happen now?" the girl asked. Marianne looked out at the dim lanterns slipping past the windows. "They will try to make the wreck tell the story they want. And can they? Only if we let them." Wexford Hall was no longer a home when she returned. Footmen who had once greeted her with quiet warmth avoided her eyes. Her favorite portrait had been removed from the blue drawing room. The household steward informed her, with the strained politeness of a man obeying instructions he disliked, that she was to remain in the West Wing until the inquiry concluded. Her private accounts would be reviewed. Her letters would be inspected before delivery. Her carriage was no longer available without Julian's written permission. The words were presented as temporary precautions, yet every one of them carried the unmistakable shape of confinement. Marianne thought of the women whose business matters her father had once helped settle after careless husbands had consumed their dowries. She had been taught early that a wife could possess money in trust and still be made to feel penniless if the wrong man controlled every door around her. Julian had not physically locked her away. He had simply made every path out of his house depend upon his approval. In her chamber, Elsie helped remove Marianne's soaked cloak. "Your Grace," she said hesitantly, "there is someone downstairs asking for you." Marianne turned. "Who?" "Mrs. Anwen Price, from the lighthouse cottages." Cold moved through Marianne's chest. The cottages stood beneath the eastern cliff, sheltered by the old lighthouse estate her mother had left in a separate trust. 6 families lived there: fishermen, rope makers, widows, and children whose fathers worked the roughest waters of Wexford. Marianne had spent the last 2 years using the modest income from that trust to repair the roofs and reinforce the seawall. "Bring her through the garden passage," she said. "And tell no one." Mrs. Price arrived 10 minutes later, soaked to the bone and carrying her youngest boy against her shoulder. The child slept with his face pressed into her neck, unaware of the adult terror around him. Anwen Price was not a woman easily frightened. She had delivered babies during storms, buried a husband lost at sea, and once argued a customs officer into releasing an entire catch of herring that had been wrongly taxed. Tonight, however, her lips were white. "They came with papers," she said. "Men from Mr. Vale's office. They say the lighthouse cottages are to be emptied before sunrise." Marianne stared at her. "On what grounds?" Anwen handed over a folded notice. The order claimed that the cliff had become unsafe because the lighthouse foundation was compromised. It demanded immediate demolition, allegedly to protect the tenants from collapse. Marianne read the signature at the bottom once, then again. Julian's name was there, written in the decisive black hand she knew better than her own. Beneath it was Gideon's countersignature as temporary harbor administrator. Marianne's throat tightened. Gideon did not merely want control of the docks. He wanted the lighthouse gone, the one place from which false channel lamps could be seen, or hidden, or operated. And he had persuaded Julian to sign the demolition order before the wreck reports were even written. "When did this arrive?" Marianne asked. "An hour ago." "Did they inspect the foundation?" "No, Your Grace. They did not even step inside. They said there was no time." Marianne folded the order carefully. "There is always time for an inspection when people's homes are at stake. They said the Duke himself approved it." The sentence landed with more force than the paper. Marianne had known Julian was allowing Gideon to push her aside. She had not understood how swiftly he would allow that power to reach innocent families. She wanted to defend him in her own mind, to imagine he had signed without reading, to believe he had trusted Gideon because he was overwhelmed by the storm and scandal. But even that would not excuse it. Julian's signature could tear down 6 homes before dawn, and he had given it without asking the woman who knew that coast better than anyone else. "You cannot stay in the cottages tonight," Marianne said. Take the families to St. Mark's Parish Hall. Tell Reverend Hale I sent you. He will open the storerooms, but the men will come. Let them come to empty houses. Anwen's eyes filled, though she did not cry. And you, your grace. Marianne looked toward the rain-dark windows. I am going to inspect that foundation. Elsie caught her arm as soon as Mrs. Price had left. They will stop you. Then we shall not use the road. Marianne took the brass compass from the dressing-table drawer and opened her father's tied notebook. Tucked inside the back cover was a faded sketch of the lighthouse grounds, drawn years ago in her mother's hand. A narrow drainage passage ran from the old coal cellar beneath the cliff to the abandoned signal room at the lighthouse base. Marianne had played there as a girl, long before she understood why her mother kept certain doors locked and certain charts hidden. She had not thought of the passage in years. Now the compass needle trembled, then settled, not toward north, but toward the eastern reef, and beneath the initials EV, on its back, newly visible in the candlelight, was a shallow line of engraved numbers, the exact coordinates of the false channel lamps. And beneath the initials EV on its back, newly visible in the candlelight, was a shallow line of engraved numbers, the exact coordinates of the false channel lamps. Marianne read them twice, then copied them into her tied notebook before closing the compass in her palm. The figures placed the lights not on the eastern reef itself, but on a narrow shelf below the lighthouse cliff, where the sea caves opened at low tide. A person stationed there could make a safe channel appear deadly, or lead a heavy ship straight into ruin, without ever being seen from the main harbor. Her mother had warned her as a child never to climb down to that shelf after dusk. Marianne had believed it was fear of the tide. Now she understood it may have been fear of something else entirely. Elsie stared at the numbers over her shoulder. What do they mean? They mean Gideon did not need to alter the sea, Marianne said. He only needed to alter what men believed they saw. Before either woman could speak again, the door opened without a knock. Julian stood in the threshold, wet-haired and exhausted, his coat still carrying the smell of harbor smoke. 2 footmen waited behind him in the corridor. Marianne slipped the compass beneath the fold of her skirt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Their marriage had not always been built from silence. Once, Julian had come to her, after difficult meetings, and placed every troubling letter in her hands before he read it himself. Once, when she had been frightened by a winter storm, he had stayed awake beside her until the waves quieted. But those memories felt dangerous now. They belonged to a man who had trusted her enough to ask what she thought. The man before her had taken her authority in public and left 6 families vulnerable because it was easier than admitting he had trusted the wrong brother. The crate has been secured, Julian said at last. Gideon has arranged for it to be examined in the morning. By whom? Marianne asked. A customs examiner from York. And who summoned him? Julian's face hardened. Must every word become an accusation? When every answer gives Mr. Vale more power, yes. He crossed the room and placed a folded paper on the dressing table. Marianne recognized the official watermark before she saw the contents. It was a petition for a temporary legal separation, drafted in formal language cold enough to make the destruction of a marriage sound like housekeeping. She read the first lines without blinking. The Duke of Wexford would provide separate maintenance. The Duchess would reside away from Wexford Hall during the inquiry. Control of harbor matters, coastal trusts, and associated properties would be transferred to a provisional board, chaired by Gideon Vale. Her mother's lighthouse estate was listed among the associated properties. You cannot transfer the lighthouse trust, Marianne said. It was settled upon me through my mother. The harbor board requires access to the cliffland. For what purpose? Julian did not answer. She raised her eyes. Did Gideon tell you about the false channel lamps? He told me you were at the lighthouse cottages tonight, stirring fear among tenants after I issued a safety order. I moved families from homes he intends to demolish without inspecting. You defied me. I protected them. You made it impossible for me to defend you. The words came out before he could stop them. Marianne looked at him with a calm that cost her more than anger would have. No, Julian, you made it impossible when you decided your standing mattered more than the truth. His gaze dropped to the petition. There are reports from London. The Blackthorn bonds are tied to your father's old company. If this becomes public, if it appears you used Wexford funds to protect merchant interests, then investigate, she said. Open the ledgers. Question Bell, Captain Rourke, the fisherman, the mate. Ask why Gideon knew the crate contained contraband before anyone opened it. Julian's expression shifted. She saw the question enter him. It was there, small but real. This was the moment he could have taken the paper back. He could have ordered Gideon's account sealed. He could have stood beside Marianne and let the scandal fall where evidence led it. But the house was full of guests. Lady Celia's father was already in London. Creditors would hear of the wreck by morning, and Julian had spent his whole life mistaking control for strength. Gideon has served this family loyally, he said. He is not the one whose name appears on altered manifests. Marianne felt something inside her go still. Then you have already decided. I have decided that Wexford cannot survive another public disgrace, so you will make me carry one instead. He did not deny it. Julian took the pen from the dressing table, placed it beside the petition, and held it out to her. Sign the consent. Marianne looked at the pen but did not touch it. If I sign this, Gideon gains access to the lighthouse, only until the inquiry ends. And if the inquiry finds me guilty, Julian's silence gave her the answer. She stepped away from the table. I will not sign away my mother's property to a man I believe is using it to wreck ships. Anger flashed across his face then. Not only anger at her refusal, but anger at the fear she had named too plainly. He turned toward the footman. Bring Mr. Vale. Gideon arrived quickly, as though he had been waiting just beyond the corridor. Lady Celia followed him, pale and composed in a dark green traveling gown. Marianne wondered how long the two of them had planned this particular scene. Gideon glanced at the unsigned petition, then at Julian. A difficulty. The Duchess refuses to cooperate, Julian said. Gideon sighed with practiced regret. Then I am afraid we must protect the estate from further interference. He produced another document from inside his coat. This one was not a petition. It was an order, placing Marianne's correspondence, private account books, and personal papers under seizure, pending investigation of fraud and maritime conspiracy. It also instructed the magistrate to question her conduct in relation to the wreck. Marianne read the order, then looked directly at Julian. You would authorize this? It is temporary, he said. Until the inquiry is concluded, you will let him search everything I own. If you are innocent, there is nothing to fear. The familiar phrase sounded monstrous in his voice. Marianne had heard it used against tenants whose homes were searched for unpaid grain, against widows who could not prove a debt had been settled, against sailors accused by men who held all the records. She had never imagined Julian would use it against her.
You know better,
she said. His eyes closed briefly. But when they opened, he reached for the pen. I know what Wexford needs. He signed. The scratch of ink across paper was almost quiet, yet Marianne heard it more clearly than the storm. With that signature, Gideon gained lawful access to every chart, map, and family document that might expose him. He could seize the lighthouse grounds, destroy the signal room, and remove whatever evidence Captain Venn had left behind. More than that, Julian had transformed Marianne from his wife into a suspect whose word could be dismissed before she spoke. Gideon accepted the order with a small bow. I assure you, Your Grace, we will conduct the search with discretion. Marianne met his gaze. That is what frightens me. The search began at once. Men opened drawers, lifted floorboards, inspected books, and carried out bundles of letters tied in blue ribbon. Elsie stood helplessly beside the bed, while Lady Celia watched with sympathetic eyes that never once looked ashamed. Marianne let them take what was visible. They found the brass compass in the shallow drawer, exactly where she had left it. Gideon turned it over in his hand, and for the first time, true alarm crossed his face. He recovered before Julian could notice, but not before Marianne saw it. "An old curiosity," she said. "My father collected navigation instruments." Gideon slipped the compass into the evidence pouch. "Then it will be returned once its relevance is determined." Marianne said nothing. The coordinates were already copied. The passage beneath the cliff still existed. And while Gideon searched her chamber, the real proof remained beyond his reach. At midnight, a messenger arrived from the harbor office, carrying a sealed notice for Julian. He opened it beside the fire, read only 3 lines, and went white. "What is it?" Lady Celia asked. Julian did not answer her. He looked at Marianne instead. 3 more vessels are due through the Eastern Channel at dawn," he said. "They carry the winter grain shipments." Marianne's heart dropped. Gideon had not been destroying ships merely to profit from individual insurance claims. He was preparing to wreck the grain fleet, force Wexford into default, and let the creditors seize the harbor before anyone understood who had lit the false lamps. Gideon had not been destroying ships merely to profit from individual insurance claims. He was preparing to wreck the grain fleet, force Wexford into default, and let the creditors seize the harbor before anyone understood who had lit the false lamps. Julian read the notice again, as though the ink might rearrange itself into less terrible news. "They are expected at dawn," he said. "The Hawthorn, the St. Agnes, and the Crown of Tyne." Marianne knew those names. Together they carried enough winter grain to feed Wexford's villages, supply the tenant mills, and fulfill the contracts that kept the estate solvent until spring. If the ships were lost, the immediate damage would be measured in lives and hunger. The financial damage would be measured in debts Gideon's allies could call in before the bodies reached shore. Lady Celia moved closer to Julian. "Surely the harbor office can send warning vessels." Marianne looked at her. "Not if the false lights are still burning. A warning vessel following the wrong markers will wreck beside them." Julian's gaze snapped toward her. "How do you know that?" She considered lying. The compass had been seized as evidence, and naming Captain Venn would reveal that she had kept information from his investigators. But there were 3 ships approaching in darkness, and Julian's opinion no longer mattered more than the truth. "Because someone left me Captain Elias Venn's compass," she said. It contained coordinates for the lights below the lighthouse cliff. Gideon's face did not change. That was worse than a denial. "A dead captain's compass?" he asked mildly. "You expect us to halt the harbor on the basis of a trinket? I expect the Duke to look at the tide tables, compare them to the coordinates, and ask why your crest was stitched into cloth recovered from Blackthorn cargo." Julian turned to Gideon. "What crest?" Gideon's eyes sharpened. "The Duchess has been collecting scraps from a wreck site in defiance of your authority. I would advise caution before treating her imagination as proof." "It was a gold-threaded crest," Marianne said. "The same design on your coat cuffs." Lady Celia's expression tightened almost invisibly. Julian stood between them, carrying the terrible weight of a choice he should have made hours earlier. Marianne saw him hesitate. She saw the question rise in him again. Yet the argument in the room had already become too public, too close to exposing that he had handed authority to a man who might be destroying his own estate. "The grain fleet will be delayed," he said at last. "I will send riders to the inland roads and have them signal the captains from the headland." Marianne felt the blood drain from her face. "They will not see road signals in this storm. It is all we can do tonight." "No, it is all you are willing to do while pretending you still control this." Julian's eyes flashed. "Enough. The old lighthouse lamp must be lit," Marianne continued, speaking over him for the first time in their marriage. "It has a fixed pattern that the captains know. If the official channel lights are false, the lighthouse beam will show them to turn west and hold beyond the shoals." Gideon shook his head with grave patience. "The lighthouse grounds are unsafe. You have already endangered enough people by sending tenants into panic. The tenants are safe because I removed them before your demolition crew arrived. You had no right, and you had no inspection. Julian's hands curled at his sides. The demolition order was issued on Gideon's recommendation. Yes, Marianne said, that is the problem. The room fell silent. She could see that Julian understood, at least dimly, what had happened. Every path he had chosen, giving Gideon the seal, trusting his documents, signing the seizure, authorizing the lighthouse demolition, had placed the very evidence of the scheme into Gideon's hands. The Duke of Wexford could issue commands, but he could no longer be certain they would be obeyed by men paid through accounts Gideon controlled. He could summon harbor officers, but the false reports had already begun moving through the system in his name. He had spent the night protecting Wexford from scandal, and in doing so he had given the scandal a body, a voice, and a key to every locked door. I will go to the lighthouse, Julian said. Marianne stared at him. No. His expression changed. No? You will arrive with a guard, a title, and a command. Gideon will know you suspect him. He will destroy whatever remains before you reach the cliff. Then what do you propose? It was the first real question he had asked her since the harbor bell began. Marianne looked down at the rain-streaked notice in his hand. She thought of Samuel Coates, barely conscious in the sailmaker's shed. She thought of the families in the parish hall, the fishermen whose livelihoods would vanish with the grain fleet, and the frightened boys who would be sent into dangerous water because powerful men had made an argument out of their lives. She did not want to save Julian from the consequences of what he had done. But innocent people should not drown simply because he deserved to learn a lesson. I will go through the drainage passage, she said. Elsie knows the cottages. Mr. Bell can send 2 men he trusts to the old slip. We will reach the signal room from beneath the cliff and light the true lamp before the ships reach the reef. Julian stepped closer. Absolutely not. The passage floods at high tide. The tide turns in 40 minutes. I know the timing. You are not leaving this house. Marianne almost smiled, though there was no warmth in it. You may choose to imprison me, Julian. You may choose to believe every lie your brother gives you. But you do not get to make me helpless, because your conscience cannot bear what you have done. His face went pale. Behind him, Gideon moved subtly toward the door. Marianne noticed. So did Julian. Where are you going? The Duke demanded. Gideon's expression remained smooth. To organize the riders, as you ordered. No, Marianne said. He is going to warn whoever tends the false lamps. Gideon turned back, and for the first time the polish left his voice. You have become inconvenient, Marianne. Julian looked between them. The use of her given name, spoken without respect or affection, seemed to strike him at last. Gideon had never called her that in private, not once in 7 years. He only did so now because he no longer feared her position as duchess. He believed Julian had broken it beyond repair. Stay here, Julian told Gideon. Gideon laughed softly. You are beginning to doubt me now. After you signed every paper I placed before you, after you called your own wife a conspirator before half the county. The words landed hard. Julian's face changed, not into innocence or excuse, but into the first naked recognition of his own culpability. Gideon did not need to force his hand. Julian had chosen each signature because it was easier to sacrifice Marianne than to face the possibility that his trusted brother had deceived him. Gideon saw the understanding in his eyes and smiled without kindness. Then he took the nearest lamp from the table and hurled it into the fireplace. Glass exploded. Flames climbed suddenly up the curtains. Lady Celia screamed. In the confusion, Gideon seized the harbor notice and ran from the room. Julian shouted for guards, but the corridor filled with smoke almost at once. Someone had barred the west wing doors from outside. Marianne grabbed Elsie's hand and pulled her toward the servants' stairs. The drainage passage, she said. Now. Behind them, Julian coughed in the thickening smoke. For one heartbeat, Marianne looked back at him. He was trying to force the heavy door open, while servants dragged water from the washroom. He looked less like a duke than a man trapped inside the consequences of his own decisions. "The grain ships," he rasped. Marianne held his gaze through the smoke. "I know." Then she turned away, not to forgive him, not to rescue his pride, but because dawn was coming, the sea was rising, and 300 men were sailing toward a light meant to kill them. Then she turned away, not to forgive him, not to rescue his pride, but because dawn was coming, the sea was rising, and 300 men were sailing toward a light meant to kill them. The servant's stair was nearly dark, lit only by the orange flicker of the fire, spreading behind them. Elsie stumbled once on the narrow steps, but Marianne caught her elbow and kept moving. They passed through the laundry rooms, the coal corridor, and the disused pantry beneath the old west wing, until they reached the small door leading into the kitchen garden. Rain struck Marianne's face the instant they emerged. Across the courtyard, the main house filled with shouting figures and swinging lanterns. Julian's guards would search for her soon. Gideon's men might search first. "Take the parish road," Marianne told Elsie. "Go to Reverend Hale. Tell him to keep every cottage family inside the hall, and send a boy to Mr. Bell with this." She tore a page from her notebook, writing the coordinates and the words, "Old signal room. Trust no harbor order bearing Vale's seal." "And you?" Elsie asked, fear making her young voice thin. "I will reach the lighthouse." "Alone?" Marianne thought of the passage beneath the cliff, of black water rising through old stone tunnels, and of the man who had arranged shipwrecks to silence anyone who understood his scheme. "Not alone for long," she said. "Go." The drainage passage began behind the abandoned coal store, concealed by a rusted grate, almost entirely swallowed by ivy. Marianne had not entered it since childhood. Her mother had once taken her through it during a storm, holding a lantern in one hand and Marianne's small fingers in the other. "There are doors in this world," her mother had said, "that powerful people assume they alone can open. Learn where they lead before anyone tells you they are forbidden." At the time, Marianne had thought it a strange lesson. Now, crouched in cold darkness with water already covering her boots, she finally understood. The passage smelled of salt, coal dust, and wet stone. Each turn came back to her through memory. The low arch where she had scraped her knee, the cracked wall shaped like a sleeping bird, the narrow iron ladder that led toward the cliff. She held her father's brass ruler in one hand and the lantern in the other, measuring the waterline against the marks cut into the wall. The tide had not yet reached the third mark. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the tunnel became impassable. At the far end, she found the door to the signal room standing open. Gideon had already been there. The chamber above the sea was empty except for coils of rope, a metal lantern frame, and a table covered with shipping charts. Marianne moved to the charts first. The false lamp coordinates appeared on every page, but not in ordinary ink. They were written in a code of insurance notations her father had used when calculating risk. Tiny marks beside cargo weight, wind direction, and vessel value. Gideon had copied the method without understanding that Marianne had learned it at 12 years old, sitting beside her father while he explained why a ship's worth should never matter more than the people who sailed it. The marks revealed the pattern at once. Blackthorn Maritime had insured each vessel through shell companies created after Gideon gained access to Wexford's harbor records. The ships were sent toward false lights. The wrecks would create enormous claims, while the unpaid loans against Wexford Port would allow a consortium of creditors to take possession of the docks. Gideon did not merely want money. He wanted Julian stripped of the estate he had always believed was his by right. Marianne's eyes moved to the brass lantern frame. A thin blue thread was caught beneath its hinge. She used the ruler to lift it free. The thread matched the wool from the crate. More important, its gold crest was no longer torn. It was clear enough to identify. She wrapped it in a clean corner of her handkerchief and wrote the time, place, and condition in her notebook. But the strongest proof lay beneath the frame, a small metal plate stamped with the maker's mark of Wexford Harbor, followed by a work order number. Someone had requisitioned the false lamps from Julian's own stores. Marianne searched the table and found the corresponding order in a stack of damp papers. It bore Gideon's signature, dated 6 weeks earlier, and described the lamps as replacement safety apparatus for Eastern Channel repairs. She almost laughed at the cruel elegance of it. Gideon had used Wexford money to buy the tools that would ruin Wexford. She folded the work order with the cloth and slipped both inside her bodice. The great lighthouse lamp stood behind a rusted iron door. Marianne forced it open and found the old mechanism intact, though its oil reservoir was nearly empty. Gideon had expected the building to be demolished before anyone could use it. He had not expected Marianne to know that the reserve tank was hidden beneath the floorboards. She pried them up with the iron ruler, filled the reservoir, and turned the crank. At first, nothing happened. Then the great lens began to move, slow and stiff with neglect. Marianne climbed the inner stairs, each step shaking beneath her feet, and reached the lantern room just as the first pale line of dawn appeared beyond the storm clouds. Far out at sea, 3 shadows moved toward the reef. The grain fleet. She set the lamp shutter into the old emergency pattern. 2 long beams, 1 short, then darkness. The signal every captain entering Wexford waters had been taught to recognize as an order to turn west and hold position. The light cut through the rain. Once, twice, again. For several terrible minutes, the ships continued forward. Then the nearest vessel, the Hawthorn, changed course. Its bow turned away from the Eastern Channel. The St. Agnes followed. Finally, so slowly Marianne feared she had imagined it, the Crown of Tyne swung westward and vanished toward safer water. Her knees weakened. She gripped the rail until the shaking passed. She had saved the grain fleet, but not Wexford's reputation, not the harbor, not her marriage. Those debts would remain. A shout sounded from below. Marianne looked through the rain and saw Mr. Bell climbing the hill with 2 fishermen and, behind them, Julian. He was bareheaded, his coat torn at one shoulder, soot streaking his face from the fire. He reached the signal room breathing hard. His gaze went first to the lamp, then to the ships moving safely beyond the reef. "You did it," he said. Marianne looked at him without softness. "No, the captains did their duty when they saw the right signal." Bell entered behind him and stared at the charts on the table. His old hands began to tremble. "These are the harbor work orders," he whispered. Mr. Vale signed for the lanterns himself. Julian crossed the room, and Marianne placed one hand over the papers before he could touch them. "Do not." He stopped. "Marianne, you may read them when they are placed before a magistrate, in the presence of witnesses. I will not hand you proof, only to watch you decide later that protecting your brother is more convenient." The pain in Julian's expression was real. It did not repair anything. "You are right," he said. "I signed orders without reading them. I let Gideon use my authority against you. I chose to believe him because the alternative made me ashamed." Marianne's throat tightened despite herself. It was the first time he had named the truth without wrapping it in duty or necessity. But she could not afford to let remorse become another trap. "Then prove you understand," she said. "Mr. Bell will carry these documents to the parish constable. Captain Rourke and the fishermen will witness where they were found. You will not take them from me. You will not speak for me." Julian nodded once. "What do you need?" "A carriage to St. Mark's. The cottage families must be kept safe, and Samuel Coates must be moved before Gideon reaches him." Julian's face sharpened. "Gideon knows about the mate. Then we are already late." They left the lighthouse together, but Marianne walked ahead. By the time they reached the parish road, Mr. Bell had dispatched a fisherman with the work order, cloth, and written record to the constable. Marianne watched the man disappear into the grey morning and allowed herself one breath of relief. The evidence was moving beyond Gideon's hands. At St. Mark's, however, that relief died at once. The parish hall doors stood open. Blankets lay scattered across the floor. Mrs. Price's kettle had been overturned. Reverend Hale sat on the church step with blood at his temple, supported by Elsie, who was crying silently. "They came before dawn," the Reverend said. "Men carrying a warrant. They took Samuel Coates from the sailmaker's shed." Marianne's chest went cold. "Where?" Elsie looked at her, terrified. Mr. Vale's men said they were taking him to the harbour office, but one of the fishermen followed the cart. "It did not go to the harbour." Julian stepped forward. "Then where did it go?" Elsie swallowed. "Back to the lighthouse." Above them, the old lamp still turned against the fading storm, and from its lantern room, a dark shape moved across the glass, holding Marianne's evidence up to the flame. Above them, the old lamp still turned against the fading storm, and from its lantern room, a dark shape moved across the glass, holding Marianne's evidence up to the flame. Julian ran first. Marianne followed close behind, her skirts heavy with rain and mud as they crossed the slope toward the lighthouse. The beams swept over the cliff in slow, pale circles, exposing the broken windows and the sea raging below. By the time they reached the entrance, smoke had begun curling from the upper stairwell. "Gideon!" Julian shouted. No answer came. Mr. Bell and the fisherman arrived behind them, but Marianne stopped them before they could rush inside. "The floorboards in the signal room are weak," she said. "If you go up all together, they will collapse." Julian looked at her sharply, as if remembering that she knew the building not because she had trespassed upon it, but because it had belonged to her mother long before he thought to take it away. "Tell us where to step," he said. Marianne gave the instructions without softness. "Left side of the first landing. Avoid the dark boards. Do not touch the southern wall, where the old oil pipe ran beneath the plaster." Julian followed every word. It was not trust restored, it was necessity. Yet the difference mattered because, for the first time, he understood that his authority had never made him the person most capable of protecting Wexford. At the top of the stair, they found the signal room ablaze. Gideon had overturned the table, and the charts were burning in the fireplace and across the stone floor. The iron lantern frame lay open, empty of its maker's plate. The strip of blue cloth was gone. Samuel Coates was tied to a chair near the window, coughing through the smoke, but alive. Marianne rushed to him, while Julian tried to beat down the flames with his coat. "Where is Gideon?" she asked, cutting Samuel's ropes with the small knife Bell handed her. The mate's eyes were wild. He took the papers, said nobody would believe a drowned man, and nobody would believe a woman who forged a duke's name. "Did he say where he was going?" "The harbour office. He has men waiting." The ceiling cracked above them. Julian seized Marianne's arm. "We must leave." She looked toward the burning chart table. Her work order, the thread, the lamp plate, the apparent proof of Gideon's scheme, had all been carried into the fire or stolen from the room. The fisherman Bell had sent to the constable had been intercepted, or Gideon would not have known exactly what to destroy. Marianne had counted each piece as if evidence itself could protect her. Now smoke erased the careful trail she had built. Julian pulled her toward the stairs just as a burning beam crashed where she had been kneeling. They emerged into the rain coughing and half-blinded. From the cliff road below came the sound of hooves. A carriage waited in the dawn mist, surrounded by uniformed officers. Lady Celia stood beside it, beneath a black umbrella, her face composed in the manner of a woman arriving for an appointment, not a catastrophe. "Your Grace," she called to Julian, "I am relieved you are safe." Marianne saw the magistrate's clerk step from the carriage with a sealed paper in his hand. He approached Julian, bowed, and said, "By order of the county magistrate, the Duchess of Wexford is to be detained for questioning regarding maritime fraud, destruction of evidence, and unlawful interference with a Crown inquiry." Marianne laughed once, quietly. The sound startled even her. Gideon had planned every step. He had made certain the evidence appeared only in her hands, ensured that she entered the lighthouse without permission, arranged for the charts to burn while he disappeared, and now used Julian's own signed seizure order to paint her as a woman desperate enough to destroy records. Lady Celia's eyes rested on Marianne, with something close to pity. "No one wishes this to become uglier than it must," she said. "If you make a statement admitting confusion, the magistrate may permit you to remain at a private residence rather than a cell." "A private residence chosen by Gideon?" Marianne asked. Celia's mouth tightened. "You have brought this upon yourself." "No," Marianne said. "Your family has brought it upon Wexford. You merely chose the better seat while it happened." Julian took the warrant from the clerk. His eyes moved over the charges, then to Marianne. She saw exactly what it would cost him to challenge it. The magistrate had acted on documents bearing Julian's name. His own order had empowered Gideon to seize her papers. His own public accusation had made the charges plausible. If he spoke now, he would have to admit before every creditor, magistrate, and political ally that he had enabled a fraud against his wife and allowed a known danger to reach the harbour. Lady Celia's father would withdraw support. The London creditors would descend. His title would remain, but the estate beneath it might not. Marianne waited. She did not ask him to save her. She had done asking him to do what should have been natural. Julian looked toward the officers. "Do not take her," he said. Lady Celia inhaled sharply. The clerk frowned. "Your Grace, the warrant was obtained through documents I authorized without proper examination." Julian's voice was low at first, then stronger. "I publicly accused my wife before I had seen the original manifests. I transferred authority to my half-brother while knowing the evidence was controlled by him. I signed orders affecting property held in her separate trust without confirming the facts. Any inquiry that treats my earlier judgment as reliable begins with a false premise." The words changed the air around them. Mr. Bell looked at him in disbelief. The officers exchanged glances. Lady Celia's composure cracked. "Julian, think what you are saying." He turned to her. "I should have thought before I said anything at all." It was not an apology Marianne could accept. It was not even directed to her alone. It was a confession that would follow him into every meeting, every creditor's hearing, every room in London where men had once trusted his name. But it was costly, and cost was the first language Julian had spoken honestly in days. The clerk lowered the warrant. "The magistrate will require a formal statement." "He will have one," Julian said, "and he will have it today." The officers withdrew, though not far. Marianne remained under suspicion, only no longer in immediate custody. Gideon had won a public advantage. The papers were gone, Samuel had no clear proof, and the lighthouse fire made her appear reckless at best. Yet as the rain cooled, the smoke on Marianne's skin, she remembered something Captain Rourke had said the night of the wreck. There were lights where no lights should have been. At the time, she had assumed he meant the false lamps themselves, but the coordinates on Elias Venn's compass had not pointed exactly to the shelf. They had pointed slightly south of it, toward the old beacon post, visible only from the sea. Gideon's scheme required more than lanterns. It required captains to trust them, and that meant someone had been sending advance notices, letters carrying official harbor language, promises of safe passage, and details only a man with access to Wexford's seal could provide. Marianne looked down at Julian's hand. His signet ring bore the Wexford crest, carved deep enough to press a clean impression into wax. Gideon had possessed the harbour seal, but he could not have forged Julian's private correspondence without a source for the Duke's personal cipher, unless he had not forged it at all, unless someone close to Julian had supplied the letters before the wrecks began. Lady Celia had gone very still beside the carriage. Marianne watched her glove tighten around the handle of her umbrella. On the edge of the pale leather was a faint smear of blue sealing wax. the same uncommon blue used only on the Duke's private coastal dispatches. Marianne did not accuse her. Not yet. Instead, she turned to the clerk. "When the formal inquiry is held," she said, "will the magistrate require every coastal dispatch sent under the Duke's seal in the last 3 months?" The clerk nodded cautiously. "If the relevance is established." Marianne looked at Lady Celia, then at the burning lighthouse, then out toward the harbor where the grain ships had turned safely away from death. "It will be," she said, "and I would like the hearing held before the creditors meet at noon. Let Gideon explain why the ships received warnings written in the Duke's own private hand, before he has time to write another one." "It will be," Marianne said, "and I would like the hearing held before the creditors meet at noon. Let Gideon explain why the ships received warnings written in the Duke's own private hand, before he has time to write another one." By 11 o'clock, the old Wexford customs chamber was packed beyond comfort. Storm-damp coats steamed near the iron stove. Shipowners crowded the rear wall beside tenant representatives, magistrates, harbor clerks, parish witnesses, and the London creditors who had arrived earlier than anyone expected. At the front of the room stood a long oak table beneath the Wexford crest. Marianne had spent years sitting at that table beside Julian, offering figures and warnings while men twice her age pretended to listen. Today, she stood at its center alone. She wore the same dark blue gown from the night before, dried badly by the kitchen fire, its hem still stained with mud from the cliff. She had not dressed for sympathy. She had dressed for truth. Mr. Bell stood near her left shoulder, Captain Rourke beside him, and Samuel Coates sat pale but upright in a chair with Reverend Hale nearby. The parish constable had placed 2 officers beside the doors, not at Marianne's request, but because Julian had finally demanded that no one leave until the hearing ended. Across the room, Gideon Vale appeared composed once more. He wore a fresh black coat, his hands gloved, his face smooth with the confidence of a man who believed he had destroyed every piece of proof that mattered. Lady Celia sat beside him, veiled in grey. Julian stood at the far end of the table, no longer positioned above Marianne as he had been at the leasing assembly. He had taken the smaller chair reserved for the estate's representative. It was a subtle difference, but everyone in the chamber saw it. The magistrate opened the proceedings by reading the accusations against Marianne: altered manifests, interference with Crown maritime inquiries, misuse of Wexford Harbor resources, and responsibility for the wreck of the Mersey Belle. Each charge sounded heavier in the stale room than it had on paper. When he finished, Gideon rose. "This is a sad matter," he began. "The Duchess has endured distress in recent days, and no decent person can fail to feel compassion. But compassion cannot blind us to the facts. The manifests bear her seal. The recovered contraband was found on a ship governed by her harbor procedures. She entered the lighthouse without permission, where documents connected to the investigation were later destroyed by fire." He paused, allowing his eyes to settle briefly on Marianne. "My brother, the Duke, has already suffered enough embarrassment through his loyalty to her. I urge this chamber not to mistake his recent self-reproach for evidence of her innocence." Several creditors nodded. They did not care whether Marianne was guilty. They cared whether Wexford could pay them. Gideon knew it. He had built his defense around their fear. Lady Celia then rose with measured reluctance and produced a stack of letters tied in blue ribbon. "These are coastal dispatches, sent under His Grace's private seal," she said. "They show that warnings were sent to captains before each incident. The Duke's office acted responsibly. If the captains ignored them, that is regrettable, but it cannot be laid at Mr. Vale's feet." Marianne looked at the ribbons. Blue wax, blue thread, blue seals. Everything about the display had been designed to make the chamber see order, authority, and a clear chain of command. But the false letters were too perfect. That was their weakness. Her father had taught her that real commercial correspondence became untidy when it met the world. A captain, added a note. A clerk made a correction. A wet seal picked up grain dust. A route changed in the margin. Gideon's dispatches were immaculate because they had been created together, after the wrecks, by someone who knew how a letter should look, but not how it should live. "May I examine them?" Marianne asked. Gideon smiled. "Of course. We have nothing to conceal." The magistrate nodded, and the clerk brought the letters to her. Marianne did not open them at once. Instead, she studied the outer seals. Each one bore Julian's crest in blue wax, sharply impressed. Each was addressed to a captain by name. Each had been dated before the corresponding wreck. The room waited for her to fail. Marianne selected one letter, then another, and held them up beside each other. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, "how many private coastal dispatches do you send in a typical month?" Julian answered without hesitation. "Perhaps 2, 3 if the weather is severe." "And who prepares them?" "My private secretary, Mr. Ainsley." Marianne turned toward the door. "Is Mr. Ainsley present?" A thin, nervous man stepped from the crowd. He had been standing near the rear wall all morning, his hands trembling around his hat. Marianne had asked Elsie to find him before the hearing began, not because she knew he would be brave, but because she knew he had watched Julian's private papers for 6 years. "Mr. Ainsley," she said, "please tell the magistrate whether you prepared these letters." The secretary looked at Gideon, then at Julian, his face drained of color. "No," he said. A murmur moved through the chamber. Gideon's expression did not shift. "Ainsley is a clerk," he said. "He does not see every paper that leaves the Duke's desk." "No," Marianne replied, "but he sees every private seal." She lifted the letters again. "Mr. Ainsley, where is the blue sealing wax kept?" "In the Duke's study," he said faintly. "In a locked cabinet." "Who has a key?" Julian answered before the man could. "I do. Ainsley does, and Lady Celia, temporarily, because she assisted with correspondence during my mother's illness." Lady Celia's gloved fingers tightened against the table. Marianne let the silence gather. "Did you prepare these letters, Lady Celia?" Celia raised her chin. "I handled whatever work His Grace requested. There was nothing improper in it." "Then perhaps you can explain the dates." Marianne placed the first letter beside the harbour almanac Mr. Bell had brought. "This dispatch claims the Mersey Belle was warned that the Eastern Channel would be unsafe on the 9th of October. Yet it gives a tide height of 12 feet, which was recorded only on the 12th. The same error appears in the warning to the North Star 3 years ago, and in the notice to the Hawthorn yesterday." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "A copying error proves nothing." "It proves the letters were written after the tides occurred." Marianne turned the second letter over. "But there is more. Along the bottom of each page, almost invisible beneath the formal language, was a tiny black mark, 2 slanted strokes, and a dot. To everyone else, it looked like a printer's flaw." Marianne recognized it immediately. It was the notation used in Blackthorn maritime insurance records to identify a vessel designated for a high-risk claim. Her father had used a different mark for ordinary weather exposure. Only an underwriter preparing for deliberate loss would use this one. "Mr. Vale," she said, "you told this chamber that the letters cleared you because they proved warnings were sent. Yet you had already insured the ships through Blackthorn companies. You knew exactly which vessels would receive the false lights, because you marked them before the dispatches were ever written." Gideon's smile finally disappeared. An outrageous inference. "Not an inference." Marianne looked toward Samuel Coates. "Mr. Coates, did the Mersey Belle receive a letter bearing the Duke's seal before it sailed?" The mate swallowed. "Yes." "Who delivered it?" "A woman from Wexford Hall." Every gaze moved to Lady Celia. She went still beneath her veil. Gideon stood abruptly. A half-conscious sailor's memory cannot condemn a lady. "No," Marianne said, "but it can establish a route, and routes can be tested." She lifted the letters and placed them before the magistrate. These seals are meant to persuade us that Julian Wexford wrote these dispatches, yet the seal does not merely show who owned the ring, it records how the ring was pressed. She turned to Julian. Your Grace, you sign private coastal letters with your left hand. Will you demonstrate, before this chamber, the exact way you press your seal into wax? Julian looked at the letters, then at Marianne. The room had become so quiet that the rain against the windows sounded like distant applause. Gideon moved toward the door, but the constable blocked his path. Lady Celia lowered her veil, revealing fear at last. Julian removed his signet ring slowly. He held it above the blue wax, and Marianne saw the truth waiting inside the smallest detail of all. Every forged dispatch bore the crest at a slight reverse angle, pressed by someone standing opposite the desk and using the ring in the wrong hand. Every forged dispatch bore the crest at a slight reverse angle, pressed by someone standing opposite the desk and using the ring in the wrong hand. Julian looked down at his signet, then pressed it into a fresh pool of blue wax the clerk had placed before him. The Wexford crest emerged upright, angled slightly left from the pressure of his left hand. Marianne placed the nearest dispatch beside it. Its crest tilted right. A low murmur spread through the customs chamber. Lady Celia's face had lost all color. It proves only that someone used the ring, Gideon said sharply. It does not prove who wrote the letters, who arranged the wrecks, or why the Duchess's seal appears on altered manifests. You are correct, Marianne said. The seal alone does not prove everything. That is why you made the mistake of creating too much evidence. She turned to Mr. Ainsley, who had access to the Duke's signet when Lady Celia assisted with correspondence. The secretary swallowed. Lady Celia did. Mr. Vale did as well, on occasions when His Grace was away. And who instructed you to prepare the coastal lists for Blackthorn Maritime? Mr. Vale! Gideon's gaze snapped toward him. Ainsley flinched, but continued. He said the Duke required a comparison of harbor risks. Lady Celia delivered the names of the vessels. I believed it was ordinary estate business. Marianne unfolded the harbor almanac and placed it beside the dispatches. The forged warnings carry tide heights that could only have been known after the voyages occurred. Their black underwriting marks match Blackthorn's high loss notation. The letters were written after the wrecks, then backdated to make it appear the captains had ignored official instruction. She looked at Samuel Coates, and the Mercy Bell was sent from Wexford without its captain, because the man giving the order wore Gideon Vale's knot ring. Samuel raised a trembling hand toward Gideon. That is him, he said. He was under the oilskin. He said the Duke needed the vessel gone before the tide changed. Gideon smiled without warmth. A frightened sailor, identifying a man from a ring? This is your grand case. No, Marianne said. This is the part where you explain the insurance. She drew a folded page from inside her sleeve. It was the copy she had made in the signal room before Gideon burned the original charts. The code marks, the vessel names, the values, and the route of each false claim. You insured the ships through Blackthorn Shell Companies. You used Wexford's harbor supplies to install false lamps. You planned the wrecks, then intended to let the creditors call in the loans you had quietly purchased through agents in London. Once Wexford Port failed, you would own the debt against it, control the docks, and leave Julian with a title stripped of the land that gave it power. The creditors shifted uneasily. One elderly man at the end of the table looked toward Gideon in sudden alarm. You purchased the Wexford notes? He demanded. Gideon's composure fractured at last. I purchased lawful debt from men too cowardly to hold it. Through Blackthorn, Marianne said. The company whose cargoes you deliberately destroyed. The magistrate leaned forward. Is that true, Mr. Vale? Gideon glanced toward Lady Celia. In that instant, Marianne understood the last part of the scheme. Celia had not merely lent access to Julian's seal. Her father's political alliance would have made her Julian's acceptable replacement once Marianne was disgraced and a legal separation forced through. Gideon would own the debt. Celia's family would control the Duke. Marianne would be blamed for the ruin, and everyone who knew the truth would be silenced by scandal, fear, or the sea. Lady Celia rose abruptly. I did not know he meant to kill anyone. Gideon laughed once, bitterly. You knew enough to write the letters. I thought the ships would be delayed, she whispered. I thought it would frighten the creditors, not drown sailors. You thought exactly what made you comfortable. Marianne did not defend her. A person did not become innocent because the cruelty they assisted proved larger than they expected. The magistrate ordered the constable to seize the dispatches, the Blackthorn records, and every account connected to the purchased Wexford notes. Gideon stepped backward, reaching inside his coat. Julian moved before anyone else could. He caught his half-brother's wrist and forced the pistol from his hand onto the table. For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence. Gideon's eyes burned with years of resentment. You had everything, he said. The title, the estate, the father who named you heir. You never even noticed what you took. Julian's grip remained firm, though pain crossed his face. No, he said. I noticed nothing that mattered until I had nearly destroyed it myself. The constable took Gideon away in irons. Lady Celia was escorted separately to answer for forgery, conspiracy, and the misuse of private correspondence. No one in the chamber looked triumphant. Too many people had been endangered. Too many lives had been treated as figures in a ledger. But when the magistrate dismissed the accusation against Marianne, the sound that rose from the harbour workers and tenants was not polite applause. It was relief. Mr. Bell bowed his white head. Captain Rourke removed his hat. Mrs. Price, standing at the back with the lighthouse families, began to cry openly. Marianne accepted none of it as a personal victory. She had not won because a duke had changed his mind. She had won because she had learned to preserve facts when powerful people tried to erase them. In the weeks that followed, Gideon Vale was held for trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and the deliberate endangerment of His Majesty's shipping. Blackthorn Maritime was exposed as a network of false insurers and purchased debt, its assets frozen before the creditors could seize Wexford port. Lady Celia gave evidence against Gideon, though it did not spare her public disgrace or the loss of her family's political standing. The wrecked vessels, surviving crews, received compensation from the recovered Blackthorn funds. The lighthouse cottages were restored at once, and Marianne established an independent maritime trust to support widows, injured sailors, and families harmed by fraudulent shipping claims. Her name appeared on every document, not Julian's, not Wexford's alone, but Marianne Wexford's, trustee and founder. Julian made his correction publicly at the next county assembly. He read aloud the statement no advisor wanted him to give, that he had accused his wife without examining the evidence, transferred authority to the man who used it for criminal purposes, and treated Marianne's independent property as if marriage entitled him to control it. He restored the lighthouse estate to her sole management, withdrew the separation petition, dismissed the false inquiry against her, and placed harbour oversight under a board that included dock workers, merchants, and Marianne herself. Yet when he asked whether she would return to Wexford Hall, she did not answer immediately. They stood at dusk on the repaired cliff path, where the true lighthouse beam travelled safely across the water. Julian looked tired in a way no fine coat could disguise. I do not expect you to forgive me, he said. You should not, Marianne replied. I have said sorry before the county, because the county heard me shame you. But I know a public correction does not give you back the nights when you had to fear me. He nodded. What do you want? Marianne looked toward the cottages below, where children ran between newly mended doors. My own residence at the lighthouse estate, my own accounts, my own authority over the trust. And time. You shall have all of it, and no claim upon my decision when time has passed. Julian's eyes closed briefly. No claim. That was the first promise he made that did not ask her to make his life easier. Marianne remained at the lighthouse estate through the following winter. Julian lived at Wexford Hall and sent no flowers, no grand declarations, no demands disguised as regret. He sent harbour reports when requested. He attended the board meetings but did not chair them. He paid the repairs ordered by Marianne without attaching his name to the work. In spring, when the first ships entered Wexford Harbor beneath the steady beam of the restored lighthouse, Marianne stood at the cliff rail with her tied notebook under one arm. Julian approached but stopped several steps away, waiting as he had promised. Marianne watched the vessels turn safely through the channel. Then she held out the notebook. "The summer routes need reviewing," she said. It was not a return to the marriage they had lost. It was not forgiveness purchased by a single season of good behavior, but it was an invitation to begin again where both of them could see the water clearly, and where Marianne, at last, chose the direction.